Greetings. Food is important. Necessary, even. To put it simply, the mitochondria can't be the powerhouse of the cell without food. That said, there are a lot of options when it comes to picking a food. So many that there very well may be more foods that you don't know than you do. The sheer potential for varieties and combinations is basically limitless. And thinking about it just makes you feel like an increasingly insignificant part of a massive ecosystem. More than you already are, that is. I like to consider myself semi-well-versed in the world of foods, at least well-versed enough to realize that I'm probably not actually well-versed. In other words, I'm a little bit past the peak of Mount Stupid. The biggest reason for that is that my dad loves to cook. He's the one who's actually well-versed. So just by proximity, I know a lot more about food. Not cooking, that's a whole other beast, but more about food than your average Joe. But what all the average Joes of humanity are excellent and obsessed with is categorizing things. Trying to put a universe shaped like this into a bunch of boxes that look like this. And despite how incompatible the two might seem, people have gotten pretty darn good at looking at a thing and figuring out which box it goes in, and food is no exception. There's breads, tacos, sandwiches, steaks, pizza, poultry, beans, buns, and noodles, just to name a few. But the three that are of concern today are soups, stews, and chowders. And hopefully, this will be the last guide anyone will ever need to tell the difference. So, to those of you who have the strength and courage to watch the whole video, you too can count yourself among the semi-well-versed members of Food Society. So, without further ado, let us begin. In order to begin defining a soup, I have to give a little context. There's an important distinction to make here between what I'm going to call liquids and fluids. This probably isn't going to track with their actual physics definitions, but hear me out. When I say liquid, what I'm referring to is a traditional liquid, like water, for example. The moment you stop pouring, the water is already in the shape of whatever you poured it into. Other liquids include, but are not limited to, juices, milk, mercury, and oil. Now that's all well and good, but if liquids are, well, liquid, then what's a fluid? Technically, fluids are any substance that can flow at all. But forget all of that, because my definition of a fluid is way better. A substance that will fill the shape of its container, eventually. Like barely melted chocolate or molasses. It'll fill the truck bed you put it in just fine, eventually. But it'll go a lot faster if you spread it yourself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, boy.
TLDR, for the purposes of this video, this is a liquid, this is a fluid. Okay, back to soup. Now that we've established a very liquidy foundation that is definitely seismically stable, we can talk about that base. No, not that base, the food base. The figurative or literal structure on which the rest of the food is built. For soup, this is usually put into the universe box labeled broth. Broth is a liquid. It always has been and always will be, and broth being a liquid is a key part of soup being soup. Because, cue black screen and white open sands, please. Soup is a food with a liquid base that can but does not require additional bits of food. The additional bits being things like noodles, vegetables, meat, or whatever else you guys put in soup. For example, bisque, a French dish with a liquid broth generally made of cream and boiled crustacean shells of some kind, is a soup. The key identifier being liquid broth. Some bisques have rice or the aforementioned crustacean's meat mixed in as well. But that doesn't have any effect on the fact that bisque is still a soup. Also, a small but very important point on soup and nomenclature. The word soup on its own implies savory by default. Most soups in the world are savory, so if you want to refer to a soup that is not savory, you need to verbally specify that. Cereal is a sweet breakfast soup. I don't know what the cereal scene is like everywhere else in the world, but here in America, most cereal is incredibly sweet. So, if you're gonna go around wanging things in the soup box, just be sure to specify if necessary. This is not a request. Alright, so soup is cool and all, but how is soup different from stew? What makes a stew a stew? Well, stew is slightly more complicated and nuanced than soup, but to stew it down, stew is basically just thick soup.
The base of the stew,
which is no longer a broth, is a fluid instead of a liquid. The key factor being the viscosity, the thickness of the base. There's a wide range of thicknesses that could still be considered stew base, but I'm going to use chili as a middle-of-the-road example. It'll fill the shape of the bowl you put it in, but won't fall off your spoon with the slightest bit of turbulence. The second thing that separates stew from soup is that stew requires other bits of food mixed in with the base in order to be called a stew. For chili, that's the meat, beans, the cheese, the stuff like that. But all of this raises the question, what's a stew without the other bits? We call that a sauce. It's a squares and rectangles situation where all stew bases on their own are sauces. But not all sauces are stew bases, because some sauces are liquids, which would make them soup if you added bits to them. Also, similarly to soups, stews are also implied savory. So you have to specify if you're going to classify something like rice pudding as stew. This is also not a request. Chowder is the least complicated of the three, because we have already clearly separated the soups from the stews. Chowder is, quite simply, a dairy-based stew. Pretty boring, am I right? And I'm not talking about any of those nut milks that make even less sense than the word underwhelming. I'm talking about good old-fashioned, fat-filled, nibble-squozin', delicious dairy. Now I say dairy, but by far and away the most common dairy used in chowders is cream, because it's the most fatty and delicious dairy that exists. But some of you may know of a fairly popular food that is called a chowder, but is most definitely not. Manhattan clam chowder. A variant of New England clam chowder is a tomato-based seafood soup. Period. End of story. Its broth is liquid and not made with dairy. The only reason it ever remotely may have been called a chowder was because it was based on an actual chowder. But because those idiots in early 19th century America were too busy inventing jazz and a stable economy than thinking about the differences between a soup, stew, and a chowder for 74 hours, the world was left in darkness for over a century. But the dark age is over. The bisque is here.
and we are grateful.
And so, the Soupoids, banding together with the legendary stewers of old, marched on Chowderdom to slay the Manhattan Menace, swiftly pureeing any resistance in holy fire that reduced Manhattan Manor to rubble in a matter of minutes. The world, now a safer place, was ever grateful for their sacrifice.